Sometimes the loneliest people find each other when they need it most. In 1889, Wyoming Territory, Eli Rourke had been working his father's ranch alone for years, carrying war wounds and heartache that the prairie wind couldn't blow away. Then Clara Vaughn came down from the mountains with words that cut straight to the bone. "I need a husband, and you need strong sons." Clara wasn't like other women. She was tall, tough, and better with a rifle than most men. But she brought trouble with her. Her brother had disappeared 15 years ago, along with a fortune in gold, and now strange things were happening around the ranch. Mysterious hoofprints appeared overnight. Graves were disturbed. A blood-stained ledger turned up in the family Bible. The mountains had kept their secrets for years, but some secrets refused to stay buried. What dark truth was Clara really running from when she made her desperate proposal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after Clara Vaughn rode into his life, Eli Rourke stood on his porch, watching the sun paint the Wyoming plains in shades of gold and amber. The worn leather reins of her horse hung over the hitching post, frayed from hard miles and countless journeys through mountain passes. Those reins told a story of determination, of a woman who had traveled far from whatever home she'd known to make this desperate proposition. Eli touched the bronze Civil War medal in his shirt pocket, his father's medal, earned at Gettysburg and carried through 3 years of hell. The old man had worn it only once, on the day he'd deeded the ranch to his son before consumption took him. "This land needs strong hands and a steady heart," his father had wheezed from his deathbed. "Don't let it die with us, boy." That was 5 years ago. Since then, Eli had worked the ranch alone, nursing wounds from his own war. Not just the shrapnel in his left leg that made him limp in cold weather, but the deeper wounds that came from watching too many good men die in places with names like Antietam and Bull Run. The silence of the ranch had been a blessing then, a place where the ghosts of dead soldiers couldn't follow, but silence could also be a curse. At 32, Eli had grown comfortable with solitude, perhaps too comfortable. His nearest neighbor, Jacob Steiner, lived 6 miles east, and the town of Cedar Falls was a 2-hour ride south. Some weeks, the only voice he heard was his own, talking to the cattle or reading aloud from his father's worn Bible. Clara Vaughn changed all that with 6 words. She'd ridden up to his cabin the previous evening like something out of a frontier legend, tall enough to look most men in the eye, with shoulders broad from mountain living and hands that knew the weight of an axe as well as a rifle. Her hair, dark as a moonless night, was braided tight and practical. When she dismounted, her movements had the fluid grace of someone accustomed to rough country and rougher company. "You're Eli Rourke," she'd said. "Not a question, I am. I heard about you in town. War veteran. Lost your father recent. Working this place alone." Her voice carried the slight accent of someone who'd spent time in the high country, where wind and cold shaped even the way people spoke. Eli had nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading, but intrigued despite himself. Women didn't often ride alone to remote ranches, especially not women who carried themselves like Clara Vaughn. She'd studied him for a long moment, those grey eyes of hers taking his measure like she was evaluating a horse for purchase. Then she'd spoken those 6 words that turned his world upside down. "I need a husband, and you need strong sons." The boldness of it had struck him speechless. In all his years, through war and hardship, Eli had never encountered such directness. No flowers of speech, no feminine wiles, just a practical woman stating a practical need. "Mom, name's Clara Vaughn. I've been living up in the Absaroka Mountains for the past 3 years. Trapping and hunting, getting by on my own. But winter's getting harder each year, and a woman alone has difficulties." She'd paused, her jaw tightening. "I can cook, clean, shoot straight, and work harder than most men you'd hire. I know medicine plants and can birth calves. I'm 26 years old and healthy as a horse." Eli had found his voice then. "Why me?" "Because you're decent. Doc Henley in town spoke well of you when I asked around. Said you're honest, Don't drink overmuch and treat folks fair. Said you've been alone too long and it's making you strange. A hint of something that might have been humor had flickered in her eyes. And because this land's too much for one man to work proper, you need help, even if you're too proud to admit it. She wasn't wrong. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of good grazing land, with water rights to Bear Creek and timber rights to the pine stands in the foothills. His father had built it into something substantial, but maintaining it alone was slowly killing Eli. Fences needed constant repair, cattle needed tending, and the upcoming winter would demand more preparation than one man could reasonably handle. "What exactly are you proposing?" he'd asked. "Marriage. Legal and proper. I'll pull my weight and then some, and you'll have the help you need. In time, if we suit each other, there'll be children. Strong boys who can carry on what your father built." She'd straightened her shoulders. "I won't lie to you. I'm not looking for romance or sweet words. I'm looking for partnership and security. A place to belong." The honesty of it had been refreshing and terrifying in equal measure. Eli had met women who simpered and flirted, women who spoke in riddles and expected a man to guess their meaning. Clara Vaughn laid her cards on the table like a poker player, confident in her hand. Now, in the clear light of morning, Eli wondered if he'd dreamed the entire encounter. But the evidence was there in those worn reins, in the second cup of coffee cooling on his table, in the quiet sounds coming from his barn, where Clara was tending to her horse. He'd given her his answer the night before, after she'd shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "I'll consider it," he'd said, which was more than he'd expected to say. "You can sleep in the spare room tonight, and we'll talk more in the morning." Clara had nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "Fair enough, but don't take too long deciding. Winter comes early in the mountains, and I need to know where I'll be spending it." Eli made his way to the barn, his legs stiff from the morning cold. Clara was brushing down her horse, a sturdy mountain pony with intelligent eyes and scars that spoke of hard travels. She looked up as he approached, her grey eyes direct and measuring. "Decided yet?" she asked, working on it. "Tell me about your family." Something shuttered behind her eyes. "Not much to tell. Parents died of fever when I was 12. My brother Thomas and I looked after each other until he—" She stopped brushing, her knuckles white on the brush handle. "Until he went missing 3 years back." "Missing how?" "He was prospecting up in the high country. Found some promising signs," he said. "Left one morning to check his claims and never came back." Her voice was steady, but Eli caught the pain underneath. "I searched for weeks. Found his horse wandering loose, but no sign of Thomas." "I'm sorry." Clara nodded curtly and resumed brushing. "That's when I took to the mountains myself. Couldn't stand staying in town with folks looking at me with pity. Figured if I was going to be alone, I'd do it on my own terms." Eli understood that impulse. After the war, he'd had little patience for the sympathetic looks and careful words of well-meaning neighbors. Sometimes solitude was easier than other people's attempts at comfort. "You said you can shoot," he said, changing the subject. "Better than most." She finished with the horse and hung up the brush. "Mountain living teaches you quick or you don't live long. Show me." Clara's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. She retrieved a rifle from her saddle, a well-maintained Winchester that looked to have seen considerable use. At Eli's direction, they walked to the rear of the property where he'd set up targets for his own practice. "That stump there," he said, pointing to a weathered pine stump about 50 yards away. "Can you hit it?" Without hesitation, Clara raised the rifle, sighted, and fired. Wood chips flew from the center of the stump. She worked the lever and fired again, then a third time. When the smoke cleared, the stump showed 3 neat holes clustered within a hand's span. Eli whistled low. "That's fine shooting." "I don't waste ammunition," Clara said simply, lowering the rifle. "Up in the mountains, every shot has to count." They walked back toward the cabin in comfortable silence. Eli found himself studying Clara from the corner of his eye, the confident set of her shoulders, the easy way she moved across rough ground, the practical efficiency of everything she did. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about her directness, her competence. "There's something else you should know," Clara said as they reached the porch. About why I came down from the mountains. Eli waited. Strange things have been happening up there. Riders in the night where no one should be. Old campsites disturbed. And twice I found signs that someone had been watching my cabin from the tree line. She met his eyes. I don't spook easy, but I started feeling like a rabbit being hunted. Any idea who? None. But Thomas used to say the mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets are worth killing for. Clara's hand moved unconsciously to the rifle at her side. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe I've been alone too long and started seeing threats where there aren't any. But I figured it was time to come down to safer ground. Eli nodded slowly. The territory could be dangerous. Claim jumpers, rustlers, men running from the law all found their way into the remote areas where questions weren't asked. If Clara had been living alone in the high country, she would have been vulnerable despite her obvious skills. If you're running from trouble, he began. I'm not running, Clara said firmly. I'm being practical. There's a difference. They stood on the porch for a moment, the morning sun climbing higher and warming the air. In the distance, Eli's cattle grazed peacefully in the south pasture. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace. It was the kind of morning that made a man grateful for simple things: good land, clear air, and honest work. All right, Eli said finally. We'll try it. Clara turned to look at him directly. You're sure? Sure as a man can be about something like this. We'll marry legal and see how we suit each other. But I want your word on something. What's that? If it doesn't work, if we can't make a proper partnership of it, you'll tell me straight. No suffering in silence or trying to make the best of a bad situation. Life's too short for that kind of misery. A smile, the first he'd seen from her, tugged at the corner of Clara's mouth. You have my word. And Eli, yes? Thank you. I know this isn't what you planned for your life. Eli thought about the bronze medal in his pocket, about his father's words, about the long, empty years he'd spent working this land alone. Maybe it's exactly what I planned for. I just didn't know it yet. They would ride to town that afternoon to see Reverend Powell about the arrangements. But first, there was work to do. Cattle to check, fences to mend, the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. As they headed to the barn to saddle the horses, Eli caught himself stealing glances at the woman who would soon be his wife. Clara Vaughn was a puzzle, no doubt about it. But perhaps that was exactly what his quiet, predictable life needed, a puzzle worth solving. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small whitewashed church of Cedar Falls, with Reverend Powell officiating and Doc Henley serving as witness. Clara wore a simple blue dress she'd purchased from the general store, and Eli had cleaned up as best he could in his father's Sunday suit. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like the arrangement that had brought them together. Do you, Eli Rourke, take Clara Vaughn to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. And do you, Clara Vaughn, take Eli Rourke to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. Clara's voice was steady, but Eli noticed her hands trembling slightly as they exchanged simple gold bands. When Reverend Powell pronounced them man and wife, they shared a chaste kiss that felt more like sealing a business contract than beginning a marriage. Yet there was something in Clara's eyes, relief perhaps, or gratitude, that made the moment feel significant despite its practical nature. The few townspeople who attended offered polite congratulations, though Eli caught the curious glances and whispered conversations. A frontier marriage of convenience wasn't unusual, but Clara's mountain background and obvious competence with weapons had already made her the subject of local gossip. Doc Henley shook Eli's hand warmly. You've made a good choice, son. Clara's got steel in her spine. You'll need that out there. Jakob Steiner approached as they were preparing to leave, his weathered face wearing an expression that might have been concern. Congratulations, Rourke, Mrs. Rourke. He tipped his hat to Clara, but his eyes remained watchful. Interesting timing you're coming down from the mountains, ma'am. How so? Clara's voice carried a warning note. "Oh, just that we've had some unusual activity up in the high country lately. Riders passing through, asking questions about old mining claims. Makes a man wonder what's stirring up there." Clara's face remained impassive. "The mountains are big enough for all kinds of folks, Mr. Steiner. Most of them mind their own business." Steiner smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Course they do. Well, you folks have a blessed day." He tipped his hat again and walked away, but Eli noticed he lingered near the church steps, watching them prepare to leave. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them absorbed in their own thoughts. The late afternoon sun slanted across the plains, painting the grass in shades of gold and amber. Clara sat her horse with easy grace, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. A habit, Eli realized, born from 3 years of solitary mountain living. "That Steiner fellow," she said finally. "How well do you know him?" "Well enough. He's been ranching in these parts for maybe 10 years. Keeps to himself mostly, though he's friendly enough when we cross paths." Eli glanced at her. "Why?" "Just curious. He seemed mighty interested in my business for a casual acquaintance." They rode in silence for another mile before Clara suddenly reined in her horse. "Hold up!" Eli stopped beside her. "What is it?" Clara was studying the ground near a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the boundary of his property. She dismounted and knelt beside what looked like ordinary earth to Eli's eyes, but Clara's expression was troubled. "Fresh hoofprints," she said, running her fingers over barely visible indentations in the soil. "2 horses, maybe 3. Shod, so not wild mustangs." She stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "They were here recently, yesterday, maybe this morning." Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Could be anyone. Travelers, maybe. Or someone looking for stray cattle." "Maybe." But Clara's voice carried doubt. She walked a wider circle around the trees, reading signs that were invisible to Eli. They watched the ranch for a while. "See these deeper prints? The horses stood here for some time." She pointed to scuff marks in the earth. "And the riders dismounted. Boot prints here and here. What does that tell you?" "That someone was very interested in your property. Interested enough to spend considerable time observing it." Clara remounted her horse, her movements quick and efficient. "We should get back to the cabin. I don't like being exposed out here if someone's been watching." They rode the rest of the way at a faster pace, Clara's alert posture communicating her unease to Eli. By the time they reached the ranch buildings, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant reds and purples. At the barn, Clara's horse threw its head up and sidled nervously as she attempted to dismount. The animal's ears were pricked forward, focused on something near the cabin that Eli couldn't see. "Easy, girl," Clara murmured, but her hand moved to the rifle on her saddle. "Something's got her spooked." Eli drew his own weapon, a Colt revolver he'd carried since the war. Together, they approached the cabin cautiously, using the barn as cover. Everything looked normal, but Clara's horse wasn't the only one showing signs of nervousness. Eli's cattle, usually calm in the evening, were scattered and restless in the near pasture. "The door," Clara whispered. Eli followed her gaze to the cabin's front door, which stood slightly ajar. He knew with certainty he'd secured it before they left for town, a habit ingrained by years of frontier living. They circled the cabin carefully, checking for signs of intrusion. Near the back window, Clara found what she was looking for: boot prints in the soft earth beneath the sill, and scratches on the window frame that suggested someone had forced it open. "They've been inside," she said quietly. "Looking for what?" "Let's find out." They entered the cabin together, weapons ready. At first glance, everything appeared undisturbed, but Clara's trained eye caught details Eli would have missed. A chair moved slightly from its usual position. The coffee pot turned a different direction on the stove. Subtle signs that someone had searched the small space carefully but tried to cover their tracks. In the bedroom, Clara knelt beside her traveling pack and examined it closely. "It's been searched," she announced. Whoever did this was thorough, but tried not to leave obvious signs. What were they looking for? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her face troubled. Then she reached into her pack and withdrew a worn leather saddlebag that Eli hadn't seen before. From it, she pulled a fragment of what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, its edges torn and stained with what looked like old blood. "This," she said simply. Eli studied the map fragment. It showed partial terrain features, a creek, some mountain peaks, and what appeared to be notations marking potential mining sites. In one corner, barely visible, were the initials TV, Thomas Vaughn, Clara said, answering his unspoken question. "My brother. I found this sewn into my saddle blanket a few months ago. I think he hid it there before whatever happened to him. It's a mining map, part of one. Thomas always said he'd found promising signs up in the high country. This shows some of his prospecting sites." Clara's voice was heavy with grief and determination. "I've been carrying it ever since, hoping it might lead me to answers about what happened to him." Eli studied the bloodstains on the map's edges. "Clara, if someone killed your brother for this, then they know I have it or suspect I do." She took the map back and carefully returned it to its hiding place. "That's why the watchers in the mountains. That's why someone searched our cabin on our wedding day." Her laugh was bitter. "I'm sorry, Eli. I didn't just bring you a wife. I brought you trouble." "We'll face it together," Eli said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "But first, tell me everything you know about your brother's prospecting." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion and worry. Thomas was always looking for the big strike. He'd heard stories about Spanish gold in the high country, old mines that the conquistadors worked centuries ago. Most folks thought it was nonsense, but Thomas believed. Did he ever find anything? He claimed he did. Last time I saw him, he was excited about something he'd discovered up near Granite Peak. Said he'd found signs of old workings, maybe even ore samples. Clara's hands clenched into fists. "He was going back to do more exploring when he disappeared. And you think someone killed him for what he found?" "I think someone didn't want him filing claims on land they considered theirs." Clara met Eli's eyes. "The question is who, and whether they're still out there looking for what Thomas found." As if summoned by her words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the evening stillness. Eli moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, their faces obscured by the gathering darkness. "We have company," he said grimly. Clara joined him at the window, the map fragment clutched in her hand. "Do you recognize them?" "Can't tell from here. But they're riding purposefully, not just passing through," the lead rider called out as they approached the cabin. "Eli Rourke, we need to talk." Eli recognized the voice of Sheriff Morrison, Cedar Falls' longtime lawman. Relief flooded through him. Whatever this was about, at least they were dealing with legal authority rather than claimed jumpers or worse. "It's the sheriff," he told Clara, moving toward the door, but Clara caught his arm, her grip tight. "Wait, look at the map again." Confused, Eli glanced at the fragment in her hand. In the fading light, he could barely make out the markings. But Clara pointed to a notation he'd missed before, a small symbol drawn near one of the mountain peaks. "That's not Thomas's handwriting," she whispered. "Someone else made notes on this map. Someone who knew about his discoveries." The realization hit them both at the same time. If Sheriff Morrison was here on their wedding night, asking to talk about matters that could only relate to Clara's mountain past, then perhaps their troubles were deeper than they'd imagined. "Mr. Rourke," Morrison called again, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "This is official business." Clara folded the map and tucked it inside her dress. "Whatever happens," she whispered to Eli, "I never showed you that map." "You don't know anything about Thomas's prospecting." Eli nodded, though questions burned in his mind. Together, they opened the door to face whatever Sheriff Morrison had brought to their doorstep on what should have been the quiet beginning of their new life together. The 3 riders sat their horses in the gathering darkness, and even in the dim light, Eli could see that Morrison's companions were not deputies. They were hard-faced men with the look of those who made their living through violence rather than law. "Congratulations on your marriage," Morrison said, his tone suggesting the opposite sentiment. "I'm afraid we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your new wife's activities in the mountains." Clara stepped forward. her bearing proud despite the threat implicit in the sheriff's words. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that involve missing persons and stolen property," Morrison replied. "I'm going to have to ask you both to come into town for questioning." In the silence that followed, Eli heard the evening wind sigh through the pine trees, and he realized that their simple arrangement had just become something far more complicated and dangerous than either of them had bargained for. Sheriff Morrison's questioning had lasted until well past midnight, but in the end, he'd had no choice but to release them. Clara's answers had been truthful, but carefully limited. Yes, she'd lived in the mountains. No, she hadn't seen any unusual activity. No, she had no knowledge of missing persons or stolen property. Eli had supported her account, portraying their marriage as a simple arrangement between two practical people seeking companionship and mutual assistance. But the sheriff's parting words had carried an unmistakable warning. "I'll be keeping an eye on things out your way, Rourke. Your wife's mountain past has stirred up some uncomfortable questions." Now, 3 weeks later, they had settled into an uneasy routine. Clara proved to be everything she'd promised. An excellent cook, a tireless worker, and a woman who could handle any task the ranch demanded. She rose before dawn to tend the animals, spent her days mending fences and improving the property, and in the evenings, she helped Eli with the books and planning for the coming winter. They maintained separate sleeping arrangements without awkwardness, treating each other with the courtesy of business partners rather than spouses. Yet Eli found himself increasingly drawn to Clara's quiet competence, and the moments when her careful reserve slipped to reveal glimpses of the woman beneath. This morning, Clara was teaching him to read signs, the way she'd learned in the mountains, how to spot the passage of animals, the age of tracks, the subtle indicators that revealed who or what had crossed their land. It was practical knowledge for a rancher. But Eli suspected it was also Clara's way of sharing skills that might prove necessary for their survival. "There," she said, pointing to a depression in the mud near Bear Creek, "day-old track from a shod horse. See how the edges are still sharp, but the bottom's starting to fill with seepage." Eli knelt beside her, studying the hoofprint. "How can you tell it's not one of ours?" "Size and shape. Your horses are bigger, and this one's got a distinctive nick in the right front shoe." Clara stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "Same horse that's passed through here twice in the past week? Someone's watching us. Someone's watching the ranch, anyway. Could be they're interested in the cattle, or the water rights, or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Eli knew she was thinking about the map fragment hidden in her belongings. They were walking back toward the cabin when Clara's sharp eyes caught something that made her stop abruptly. Near the creek bank, partially hidden by overgrown willows, something metallic glinted in the morning sun. "What is it?" Eli asked. Clara pushed through the brush and emerged holding a brass compass, its case tarnished with age and weather. When she opened it, the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "This was Thomas's," she said quietly, turning the compass over in her hands. "He carried it everywhere. Said our father gave it to him before he died." Eli felt a chill, despite the warm morning air. "How did it get here?" "Good question." Clara knelt and began searching the ground around where she'd found the compass. "Look at this, the earth's been disturbed. Someone buried something here, then dug it up again." She was right. The soil showed clear signs of excavation, though whoever had done the work had tried to disguise their activity. Clara began digging with her hands, following the disturbed earth. "Clara, maybe we should—" Here, she'd uncovered a piece of rotted cloth, stained dark with what could have been blood. Beneath it, her fingers found something else, a small leather pouch that chinked softly with the sound of metal on metal. Inside the pouch were several gold nuggets, each about the size of a child's thumbnail. Even Eli, who knew little about precious metals, could see their quality. The gold was pure and bright, the kind that suggested a substantial deposit somewhere upstream. "This is what they're looking for," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas found a gold deposit and someone killed him for it. Then they buried the evidence here on your land. Why here?" "Because it's remote. Because Thomas knew this area. He used to hunt these mountains when we were children. Maybe he came here to hide what he'd found, or maybe— Clara's voice caught. Maybe this is where they brought him to die. The compass needle was still spinning erratically, and Eli realized what that meant. There's metal down there. More metal than a few nuggets would account for. Clara nodded grimly. We need to dig. They returned to the cabin for proper tools, moving with the careful alertness that had become second nature since Sheriff Morrison's visit. Clara retrieved a spade from the barn, while Eli gathered rope and a lantern. Whatever was buried by the creek, they needed to uncover it before their mysterious watchers returned. The digging revealed more than they'd expected. 2 feet down, Clara's spade struck something hard, not rock but wood. Working carefully, they uncovered a small wooden crate, its sides reinforced with iron bands. The lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a protesting creak. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were Thomas Vaughn's personal effects, a journal bound in cracked leather, several more gold nuggets, surveying tools, and most significantly, additional map fragments that, when combined with the piece Clara carried, formed a more complete picture of the mining sites Thomas had discovered. Clara lifted the journal with trembling hands. The final entry was dated 3 years ago, just days before Thomas's disappearance. Found the main vein today. Richer than I dreamed. Spanish workings go deeper than I thought. This could be the mother lode. But Morrison's been asking questions around town. Think he suspects what I've found. Need to be careful. If something happens to me, I've hidden the evidence where Clara can find it. She'll know what to do. Morrison, Eli said, reading over Clara's shoulder. Sheriff Morrison knew about Thomas's discovery. Clara's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. Thomas suspected Morrison would try to steal his claim. That's why he hid everything. She looked up at Eli. My brother didn't just disappear. He was murdered by the law. The implications were staggering. If Sheriff Morrison was involved in Thomas's death, then Clara and Eli were in more danger than they'd realized. They couldn't trust the law, couldn't rely on legal protection. They were on their own against men who had already killed once to protect their secret. We need to leave, Eli said. Take what we can carry and get out of the territory. No, Clara's voice was firm. Running won't bring Thomas justice, and it won't stop Morrison from killing others who get in his way. She carefully rewrapped the journal and maps. We stay, but we're careful. And we start planning. Planning what? How to prove Morrison's a murderer without getting ourselves killed in the process. As they reburied the crate, minus the most crucial evidence, which Clara insisted on keeping with her, Eli found himself studying his wife with new respect. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a practical stranger offering a business arrangement. Now she was a woman seeking justice for her murdered brother, and Eli realized he was prepared to help her get it. That evening, they sat at their small kitchen table, studying Thomas's maps by lamplight. The gold deposits he'd identified were extensive, potentially worth a fortune to whoever controlled them. But they were also located on public land, which meant Thomas's claims would have been legal if he'd lived to file them. Morrison must have partners, Clara said. One man couldn't work claims this extensive alone. Jacob Steiner, Eli said, remembering their neighbor's curious interest in Clara's mountain background. He was asking pointed questions at our wedding, and he's been ranching here for 10 years, long enough to know the country, to know which areas might hold mineral wealth. Clara traced the map with her finger. If Morrison and Steiner are working together, they've probably been systematically eliminating anyone who got too close to their operation. How many others do you think? Hard to say. But Thomas wasn't the only prospector working these mountains. And if Morrison's willing to kill to protect his secret, he won't hesitate to kill again. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, treating their situation like the military campaign it had become. Eli's war experience proved valuable as they discussed strategy, tactics, and the importance of gathering intelligence before making any moves against their enemies. We need proof, Clara said. Something concrete that ties Morrison to Thomas's murder. The journal's a start, but it's just Thomas's suspicions. We need evidence that will convince a territorial judge or federal marshal. Then we watch and wait. Morrison will make a mistake eventually, and when he does, we'll be ready." As they prepared for bed that night, Eli found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just 3 weeks. He'd gained a wife, discovered a conspiracy, and committed himself to a dangerous quest for justice. It wasn't the quiet partnership he'd envisioned, but perhaps it was exactly what he needed, a purpose beyond simple survival, a reason to fight for something greater than himself. Clara paused at the door to her room. "Eli? Yes? Thank you. For believing me, for standing with me." Her grey eyes held depths of emotion she rarely revealed. "I know this isn't what you bargained for." "Maybe not," Eli admitted. "But I gave you my word when we married. For better or worse, in times of trouble. I meant it then, and I mean it now." Clara nodded, and for a moment something passed between them that felt like more than business partnership. Then she disappeared into her room, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that their arrangement was becoming something neither of them had planned for. Outside, the Wyoming wind whistled through the pine trees, and somewhere in the darkness, men who had killed once were undoubtedly planning to kill again. But inside the cabin, Eli and Clara Rourke were making plans of their own, and they would not be easy prey for anyone's ambitions. The carved wooden cross appeared 3 days later, driven into the ground at the head of a freshly dug grave on the eastern edge of their property. Clara discovered it during her morning rounds, and her sharp intake of breath brought Eli running from the barn. The cross was crude but carefully made, carved from pine and bearing the initials TV, in letters that matched Thomas's distinctive script. But it was the grave itself that made Clara's knees buckle, a perfect rectangle of disturbed earth, as if someone had been buried there in the night. "No," Clara whispered, dropping to her knees beside the mound. "No, no, no." Eli knelt beside her, his hand finding her shoulder. "Clara, we don't know. It's Thomas." Her voice broke on her brother's name. "Someone's telling me they buried him here, but when they dug, frantically at first, and then with growing confusion, they found nothing. The grave was empty, though clearly someone had taken considerable effort to make it appear otherwise. At the bottom of the excavation, Clara's spade struck something hard, a flat stone with words carved into its surface. "Stop looking or join him." The message was clear enough. But it raised more questions than it answered. If Thomas was dead, and Clara had accepted that likelihood months ago, where was his body? And why would his killers create an empty grave as a warning, rather than simply revealing where they'd actually buried him? "They're playing games with us," Eli said grimly, "trying to frighten you into leaving, or trying to make me so desperate for answers that I'll do something foolish." Clara ran her fingers over the carved letters of the cross. "Thomas made this. I recognize his handiwork. See how he always made the crossbar slightly longer on the right side? He did that on every wooden cross he ever carved, so they have his tools. His belongings, more than that. They know enough about him to replicate his work perfectly." Clara stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "Whoever killed Thomas knew him well, well enough to know what would hurt me most." They filled in the empty grave and carried the cross back to the cabin, where Clara examined it more closely in the full light of day. Hidden beneath the rough bark exterior, she found additional markings, tiny notches that formed a pattern only she would recognize. "It's a code," she explained to Eli. "Thomas and I developed it when we were children, playing at being soldiers and spies. These notches, they spell out a message." Eli watched as Clara carefully decoded the markings, her face growing pale as the message became clear. Cave, sunset, granite peak. She looked up at him. "Thomas is telling me where to find him, or where to find his body. Either way, I have to go." "We have to go," Eli corrected. "You're not doing this alone." That afternoon they prepared for the journey into the high country. Clara's mountain experience proved invaluable as she selected supplies and planned their route. The trek to Granite Peak would take them through some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in the territory, country where a man could disappear without a trace, and apparently had. There are caves all through that area, Clara explained as she checked her rifle. "Thomas and I explored them when we were young. If someone wanted to hide a body where it would never be found, the caves would be perfect. And if someone wanted to set a trap, that too." Clara's smile was grim. "Which is why we're going in prepared for trouble." They left at dawn, riding carefully through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they climbed toward the mountains. Clara led the way, her knowledge of the country evident in every choice of path and resting spot. She moved like someone returning home, despite the danger that awaited them. The journey took most of the day, and by late afternoon they were deep in wilderness that few white men had ever seen. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind through the pines and the distant cry of an eagle circling overhead. It was beautiful country, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "There," Clara said, pointing to a rocky outcropping near the tree line. "That's Granite Peak. The caves are just below the summit, hidden in a draw that you can't see from here." They left their horses at a sheltered spot and continued on foot, climbing through increasingly difficult terrain. Clara moved with the sure-footed grace of someone raised in the mountains, while Eli found himself grateful for the physical conditioning he'd maintained since the war. As the sun touched the western horizon, they reached the entrance to the cave system Clara remembered. The opening was larger than Eli had expected, big enough for a man to enter upright, though it narrowed quickly beyond the entrance. "Thomas?" Clara called softly into the darkness. Her voice echoed back, distorted by the stone corridors ahead. They lit a lantern and entered the cave, moving carefully over the uneven floor. The walls were marked with ancient pictographs, symbols left by the indigenous peoples who had used these caves for generations. 50 feet into the mountain, they found what they were looking for. Thomas Vaughn's body lay in a natural chamber, arranged with what might have been respect or mockery. Eli couldn't tell which. The remains were largely skeletal after 3 years, but enough clothing and personal effects remained to confirm his identity. Clara knelt beside her brother's body, her face a mask of grief and fury. "At least now I know," she whispered, but Thomas had left more than just his remains in the cave. Hidden beneath his body, protected by oiled canvas, was another cache of documents. Maps, assay reports, and most importantly, a detailed record of his discoveries, not just the location of gold deposits, but evidence of previous mining activity that predated the territorial surveys. "Spanish workings," Eli said, studying the documents by lantern light. "Your brother found evidence of mining operations that go back centuries, which means the land claims would be disputed. Anyone trying to file new claims would face legal challenges that could take years to resolve." Clara's voice was thoughtful. "Unless they could eliminate anyone who knew about the original workings, like your brother, and now like us." They gathered Thomas's evidence and prepared to leave, but Clara insisted on one final act. Using stones from the cave floor, she built a proper cairn over her brother's remains, marking the spot so she could return someday with a proper burial detail. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," she whispered to the stones, "but I promise your death won't go unpunished." The journey back to their horses was treacherous in the gathering darkness, but Clara's knowledge of the terrain guided them safely down the mountain. They rode hard through the night, both of them aware that they now possessed evidence that men had killed to suppress. By dawn, they were back at the ranch, exhausted but determined. Clara spread Thomas's documents on their kitchen table, studying them with new purpose. "Look at this," she said, pointing to one of the assay reports. "Thomas found evidence of gold deposits worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, enough to kill for, enough to build an empire on if you could control the claims." Clara's finger traced the map to show the extent of the Spanish workings. "Morrison and his partners aren't just stealing from prospectors, they're stealing history." Eli studied the documents with growing understanding. The conspiracy was larger than they'd imagined, involving not just murder, but systematic theft of mineral rights across a vast area of the territory. If they could prove it, they could bring down more than just Sheriff Morrison They could expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. We need to get this evidence to someone we can trust, he said. Who? Morrison controls local law enforcement, and if this goes as high as I think it does, we can't trust territorial authorities either. Federal marshals. They answer to Washington, not to local interests. Clara nodded slowly. But how do we contact them without Morrison finding out? And how do we stay alive long enough for help to arrive? Those were questions they would need to answer quickly. Outside, the morning sun was rising over the Wyoming plains, but Eli knew their troubles were far from over. If anything, they were just beginning. The blackened Bible came to light when Clara was cleaning the cabin's false floor, a hiding place Eli's father had constructed during the Indian Wars, but had never mentioned to his son. Clara's keen eye had noticed the slight unevenness in the floorboards, and her mountain-bred curiosity had led her to investigate. The Bible was old, its leather binding cracked and stained with what appeared to be dried blood. But it was what hidden between its pages that made Clara's breath catch. A ledger written in careful script, documenting mining partnerships, claim boundaries, and financial arrangements that painted a clear picture of conspiracy and murder. "Look at this," Clara said, spreading the ledger pages on their kitchen table. "It's all here. Every claim, every partnership, every dollar that changed hands." Eli studied the entries, his understanding growing with each line. The conspiracy involved far more people than just Morrison and Steiner. Prominent businessmen from Cedar Falls, territorial officials, even federal land agents, all working together to systematically steal mining claims from legitimate prospectors. "They've been at this for years," he said. "Look at these dates. Some of these entries go back a decade. And look at this column." Clara pointed to a series of notations marked with red ink. Names of prospectors who disappeared or had accidents. Thomas is listed here, along with at least a dozen others. The ledger was methodical in its documentation of crime. Each murdered prospector was listed with the date of their death, the location of their claims, and the amount of gold or silver their properties were estimated to contain. It was a businessman's approach to mass murder, treating human lives as obstacles to profit. "This is enough to hang them all," Eli said grimly, "if we can get it to the right authorities. But first, we need to understand how deep this goes." Clara turned to a section of the ledger marked Territorial Payments. "Look at these names. Judge Hawkins, Land Commissioner Reynolds, even Territorial Governor Matthews. They're all receiving payments. The scope of the corruption was staggering. The conspiracy wasn't just stealing from individual prospectors. It was subverting the entire territorial government to ensure their illegal claims would be protected by law. Anyone who tried to challenge them would face not just violence, but a legal system designed to protect their enemies. "We can't trust anyone in the territory," Clara concluded. "Everyone with authority is either part of the conspiracy or too frightened to act against it." That afternoon, they received an unexpected visitor. Doc Henley rode up to their cabin alone, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by obvious worry. Clara quickly hid the ledger while Eli went out to greet the town's physician. "Doc, what brings you out this way?" Henley dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Had to check on the widow Johnson's boy. Took a bad fall from his horse. But I wanted to stop by and have a word with you folks." They invited him inside for coffee, but Henley remained standing, his eyes constantly moving to the windows as if expecting trouble. "I'm going to speak plain," he said finally. "There are folks in town asking questions about your wife's background, specifically about what she might have brought down from the mountains." "What kind of questions?" Clara asked. "The kind that suggest they know more about your brother's disappearance than they're letting on." Henley's voice dropped to a whisper. "Clara, I delivered you and Thomas when you were born. I watched you both grow up, and I knew your brother was too smart and too careful to simply vanish in the mountains." "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying that if Thomas found something valuable up there, and if certain people knew about it, then his disappearance starts making sense." Henley met Clara's eyes directly. And I'm saying that whatever you know, whatever you've found, you need to be very careful who you trust with it. The warning was clear, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Did Doc Henley know about the conspiracy? Was he trying to protect them, or was he fishing for information on behalf of Morrison and his partners? We appreciate the warning, Eli said carefully. There's more. Henley moved closer to the window, peering out at the yard. Sheriff Morrison's been recruiting deputies, men who aren't from around here, men with hard faces and gun experience. He claims it's because of increased criminal activity in the territory, but folks are starting to wonder what? Whether Morrison's preparing for war rather than law enforcement. Henley turned back to them. If you folks are planning to leave the territory, now might be a good time to do it. After Henley left, Clara and Eli spent the evening discussing their options. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before Morrison made his move against them. We need allies, Clara said. People we can trust who aren't part of Morrison's conspiracy. Doc Henley might be one. His warning seemed genuine. Maybe, but we can't be sure. Clara studied the ledger entries again. What about your military contacts? Anyone from your unit who might be able to help? Eli considered the question. Most of his fellow soldiers had scattered after the war, seeking new lives far from the memories of battle. But there was one man who might be willing to help, Captain James Mitchell, who had commanded their unit during the final campaigns. Mitchell had retired to Colorado, where he was now a federal marshal. There might be someone, Eli said slowly. But getting word to him without Morrison finding out will be difficult. We'll find a way. We have to. That night they were awakened by the sound of horses moving around their property. Clara slipped from her bed and joined Eli at the front window, both of them armed and alert. In the moonlight, they could see at least 4 riders circling the cabin at a distance, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They're not trying to hide, Clara whispered. They want us to know they're out there. Psychological warfare, trying to wear down our nerves before they make their real move. The riders continued their circuit for nearly an hour before disappearing into the darkness. But their message was clear. Clara and Eli were being watched, and their enemies were growing bolder. The next morning brought fresh evidence of harassment. Their cattle had been scattered again, fences cut in a dozen places, and the water trough had been contaminated with what appeared to be kerosene. It was the work of professionals, men who knew how to cause maximum disruption without leaving clear evidence of their involvement. They're trying to force us to make a mistake, Clara said as they surveyed the damage. Hoping we'll panic and do something stupid, or hoping we'll try to run so they can pick us off on the trail. Then we disappoint them. We stay calm, we stay smart, and we wait for our chance. But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew their situation was becoming untenable. Morrison and his partners had all the advantages: numbers, local authority, and the backing of territorial officials. She and Eli had only the truth, and truth had a way of getting buried along with the people who possessed it. That evening, as they worked to repair the damaged fences, Clara made a decision that would change everything. Eli, I want you to ride to Colorado. What? Find your friend Mitchell. Bring him back with federal authority to investigate Morrison and his conspiracy. Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes held depths of determination. I'll stay here and protect the ranch. Absolutely not. I'm not leaving you alone to face Morrison's men. You're not leaving me. You're going for help. It's our only chance. They argued about it through the evening, but Clara's logic was unassailable. Someone had to get word to federal authorities, and someone had to stay behind to protect the evidence. If they both left, Morrison would simply destroy everything and claim they'd fled the territory. If you stay, you'll be killed, Eli said bluntly. Maybe, but if neither of us goes for help, we'll both be killed eventually. Clara took his hands in hers. This is bigger than just us now, Eli. If Morrison and his partners succeed here, they'll do the same thing in other territories. How many more prospectors will die? How many more families will be destroyed? Eli looked into his wife's gray eyes and saw the steel that had kept her alive in the mountains for 3 years. Clara Vaughn Rourke was not a woman who gave up, and she was not a woman who ran from a fight. "All right," he said finally. "But you don't face them alone. You disappear into the mountains until I get back with help." "Agreed. I'll take Thomas's evidence and hide it where Morrison will never find it. And Clara?" "Yes? When this is over, we're going to have that real marriage we talked about. The kind with love and partnership and a future together." Clara's smile was the first genuine one he'd seen from her since their wedding day. "I'd like that, Eli. I'd like that very much." They spent the rest of the evening making plans for both of their survivals, knowing that the next few weeks would determine not just their fate, but the fate of justice in the Wyoming Territory. The leather pouch of gold dust was hidden exactly where Clara had expected to find it, sewn into the lining of Thomas's old saddlebags, which they discovered in the barn loft beneath a pile of moth-eaten horse blankets. The pouch contained enough pure gold to prove, beyond doubt, that the mine existed and that it was substantial enough to justify the murders that had been committed to control. Clara weighed the gold dust in her palm, feeling the satisfying heft of genuine wealth. "This is from the main vein," she said, studying the nugget's color and texture. "Thomas always said he could tell different deposits by the look of the gold they produced." "How much do you think it's worth?" Eli asked. "In raw value, maybe $500. But as proof of what's buried up in those mountains." "Priceless." Clara carefully returned the gold to its pouch. "This is what they're really after. Not just the gold Thomas found, but the location of the mother lode." They had been preparing for Eli's departure to Colorado for 3 days, gathering supplies and making arrangements for Clara's survival in the mountains. But the discovery of Thomas's gold changed their timeline. If Morrison suspected they had found actual ore samples, he would move against them immediately. "We leave tonight," Clara decided. "Together, until we're far enough from the ranch that you can break off for Colorado while I head for the high country." "Clara," no arguments. "Look at this gold, Eli. Look at its quality. Morrison and his partners have killed more than a dozen people for deposits that aren't half as rich as what Thomas discovered. They won't wait much longer to come for us." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the evening air. But this time, it wasn't the cautious circling they'd grown accustomed to. This was a direct approach, bold and threatening. Jakob Steiner rode into their yard with 3 men Clara didn't recognize, all of them armed and looking like they meant business. Steiner dismounted while his companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Evening, folks," Steiner called out, his voice carrying false joviality. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Eli stepped onto the porch, Clara beside him, both of them armed but not openly threatening. "What can we do for you, Jakob?" "Well, that's the thing. We've been hearing some disturbing rumors around town. Stories about Clara here causing trouble, asking questions about things that are better left alone." Steiner's smile was cold. "Sheriff Morrison thought maybe we should have a friendly conversation about it." "What kind of conversation?" Clara asked. "The kind where we explain that some secrets are dangerous to know. The kind where we suggest that maybe it's time for you folks to consider relocating to someplace more hospitable." One of Steiner's men shifted in his saddle, and Clara caught the glint of metal as his hand moved to his gun. The threat was clear: submit or face the consequences. "That's generous advice," Eli said carefully. "But we're pretty well settled here. Are you?" Steiner walked closer to the porch, his movements casual but predatory. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been having some difficulties. Scattered cattle, broken fences, contaminated water. Sometimes the land tells you when it's time to move on. And sometimes men make the land tell lies," Clara replied, her voice steady. Steiner's facade of friendliness dropped away entirely. "Careful, Mrs. Rourke. Your brother learned the hard way that some conversations are dangerous to have." The admission hung in the air like gunsmoke. Steiner had just confirmed Clara's suspicions about Thomas's fate, and he'd done it deliberately, a message that the same fate awaited anyone who interfered with their operation. "Is that a threat?" Eli asked. "It's a fact. Thomas Vaughn found things in the mountains that weren't his to find. He asked questions that weren't his to ask. And when he wouldn't listen to reason, Steiner shrugged. Well, the mountains can be dangerous for careless men. Clara's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her rifle, but Eli caught her wrist. Starting a gunfight with 4 armed men was suicide, no matter how justified their anger. We'll consider your advice, Eli said diplomatically. You do that. Consider it real careful. Steiner remounted his horse, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Because sometimes the next conversation isn't quite so friendly. They rode away into the gathering darkness, but their message was unmistakable. The time for subtlety was over. Morrison and his partners were done playing games. Pack everything we can carry, Clara said as soon as the riders were out of sight. We leave in an hour. They worked with desperate efficiency, gathering essential supplies, weapons, and most importantly, all of Thomas's evidence. Clara sewed the gold dust into her jacket lining, while Eli loaded their horses with provisions for an extended journey. Where will you go? Eli asked as they made final preparations. There's an old trapper's cabin up near Elk Creek. Thomas and I used it as children when we were playing at being mountain men. It's isolated, defensible, and Morrison's men will never find it unless they know exactly where to look. And the evidence? I'll hide it in places only I can find. Even if they capture me, they'll never locate Thomas's records without my cooperation. They led their horses away from the ranch on foot, staying off the main trails and using Clara's knowledge of the country to avoid detection. 5 miles from the cabin, where a creek formed a natural boundary between territories, they stopped to say goodbye. How long to reach Colorado? Clara asked. 2 weeks there, maybe 3 back with a federal marshal and his men. A month total, if everything goes right, and if everything goes wrong. Eli pulled Clara into his arms, holding her tightly against the cold mountain air. Then we'll face it together somehow. I'm not losing you, Clara, not to Morrison, not to anyone. Just promise me one thing, Clara whispered against his chest. If something happens to me, don't let them get away with it. Don't let Thomas's death be for nothing. Nothing's going to happen to you. You're the toughest person I know, mountain-raised and steel-backed. Morrison's men won't even know you're out there until federal law arrives to arrest them. Clara stepped back, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears. Go, ride hard, and don't look back. I'll be waiting for you when you return with help. Eli mounted his horse and turned toward the Colorado Trail, but he couldn't resist one last look at his wife. Clara stood in the moonlight like a frontier goddess, rifle in hand, ready to disappear into the wilderness that had shaped her. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, and Eli knew that Morrison had no idea what he was up against. The ride to Colorado would be the longest month of Eli's life. Clara watched until Eli disappeared into the darkness, then turned toward the mountains that had been her refuge before and would be again. But as she led her horse up the winding trail toward Elk Creek, she discovered that Steiner's visit had been more than just intimidation. It had been reconnaissance. Her horse snorted and shied as they climbed. Its ears pricked toward something Clara couldn't yet see. Then the smell reached her, wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. Someone had built a fire somewhere ahead, in country where no honest travelers had any business being. Clara left her horse tied to a pine tree and continued on foot, using every skill Thomas had taught her about moving silently through rough country. What she found made her blood run cold. The old trapper's cabin was occupied. Light flickered through the single window, and she could see at least 2 men moving around inside. Her refuge had been discovered and claimed by Morrison's men, who were apparently more familiar with the high country than she'd realized. Worse, as she watched from concealment, she recognized one of the figures in the cabin, Sheriff Morrison himself, studying what appeared to be a map spread on the cabin's rough table. They weren't just searching for her randomly. They knew exactly where she was likely to go, and they were waiting for her. Clara backed away from the cabin carefully, her mind racing through alternatives. The mountains were vast, but Morrison seemed to know them better than she'd expected. If he could predict her movements, then nowhere was truly safe. She would have to become not just a fugitive, but a hunter. Instead of simply hiding until help arrived, she would have to take the war to Morrison and his men. It was dangerous, suicidal probably, but it was also the last thing they would expect from a lone woman with limited resources. Clara smiled grimly as she retrieved her horse and began planning her campaign. Morrison had killed her brother, threatened her husband, and stolen her refuge. But he had also made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the mountain woman who carried Thomas Vaughn's blood and his thirst for justice. The hunt was about to begin, and Clara intended to be the hunter rather than the prey. Clara found Thomas's final hideout by following the old hunting trails she remembered from childhood. Paths that wound through dense timber and over rocky ridges, where even experienced trackers would struggle to follow. The cache was hidden exactly where Thomas's coded message had indicated, behind a waterfall that required careful climbing to reach. In a natural cave that could only be accessed during the dry season, Thomas had been thorough in his preparations. The cave contained not just his personal belongings and evidence of the mining conspiracy, but a complete record of his investigation into the corruption that had cost him his life. Maps, assay reports, and most damning of all, a detailed journal that named names and documented crimes with the methodical precision of a man who knew his life was in danger. But it was what Clara found at the bottom of Thomas's carefully organized cache that changed everything she thought she knew about her. Brother's murder, Sheriff Morrison's deputy badge, tarnished with age and bearing the distinctive scratch Morrison had acquired during a gunfight years earlier. Clara stared at the badge in disbelief, turning it over in her hands as the implications became clear. Morrison hadn't just been Thomas's enemy, he had been Thomas's partner. The truth was laid out in Thomas's final journal entries, written in increasingly frantic handwriting as he realized the scope of the betrayal he faced. Morrison came to me 6 months ago with a proposition, said he'd heard about my discoveries and wanted to discuss a partnership. I was fool enough to trust him. He's worn the badge for 15 years, seemed like an honest lawman. He proposed that we work together to file claims on the richest deposits, splitting the profits equally. Said his position would protect us from claim jumpers and crooked land agents. It took me weeks to realize Morrison wasn't offering protection from corruption. He was the corruption. Every prospector who disappeared in the past 5 years, every accident or Indian attack that had eliminated competition for the best claims, Morrison was behind all of it. He's been systematically murdering anyone who found valuable deposits, then filing claims under false names and working the mines with hired killers. I tried to back out of our partnership. Told Morrison I'd changed my mind about mining, but he knew I'd learned too much. Yesterday he told me I had 3 choices: join his operation completely, disappear forever, or face the same fate as the other prospectors who'd crossed him. I chose a 4th option. I'm documenting everything, hiding the evidence where Clara can find it if something happens to me. Morrison thinks he's dealing with a naive prospector, but Thomas Vaughan has fought Apaches and claimed jumpers and worse. If he wants a war, I'll give him one. The final entry was dated the day before Thomas's disappearance. Morrison's coming for me tomorrow. I can see his men watching from the ridge line, at least 4 of them, maybe more. I've prepared the cave and hidden everything Clara will need to bring them to justice. If I don't survive, at least the truth will. Morrison made one critical mistake. He underestimated the Vaughn family's capacity for vengeance. Clara set down the journal with trembling hands. Thomas hadn't just stumbled onto a mining conspiracy. He'd been recruited into it by the very man who would eventually kill him. Morrison had used his badge and reputation to lure prospectors into partnerships, then eliminated them once he'd learned the locations of their discoveries. But the revelations didn't end there. Hidden beneath Thomas's journal was a correspondence file that documented the full scope of Morrison's network. Letters to and from territorial officials, federal land agents, and prominent businessmen throughout the region. The conspiracy wasn't limited to one county or even one territory. It stretched across the entire western frontier. a coordinated effort to steal mineral wealth from legitimate prospectors and funnel it to a small group of powerful men. Most shocking of all was a letter from Territorial Governor Matthews himself, congratulating Morrison on his efficient resolution of the Vaughn problem and promising additional compensation for maintaining order in the mining districts. Clara read the letter 3 times before its meaning sank in completely. Thomas's murder hadn't just been sanctioned by territorial authorities, it had been ordered by them. The conspiracy reached to the highest levels of government, making it far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She photographed each document using a small camera Thomas had hidden with his other equipment, then carefully returned everything to its hiding place. The evidence was too valuable to risk carrying with her, but she needed copies she could transport safely. As she prepared to leave the cave, Clara discovered one final surprise: Thomas's personal rifle, a customized Winchester with his initials carved into the stock and modifications that reflected years of frontier use. It was the rifle he'd carried during their childhood hunting trips, the weapon that had put food on their table after their parents died. Clara lifted the rifle reverently, feeling the familiar weight and balance. Thomas had maintained it perfectly, and ammunition was plentiful in his cache. More than just a weapon, the rifle represented her brother's legacy and her inheritance of his fight for justice. The climb down from the waterfall was treacherous in the growing darkness, but Clara's mountain skills served her well. She reached her horse as the first stars appeared overhead, her mind already working through the implications of what she'd discovered. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was the center of a web of corruption that reached from Wyoming Territory to Washington, D.C. Fighting him would mean fighting the entire territorial government, and possibly federal authorities as well. The odds against her were overwhelming, but Clara had spent 3 years surviving alone in some of the harshest country on the continent. She understood better than most that survival wasn't about having good odds. It was about refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. More importantly, she now understood that Thomas hadn't died as a victim. He died as a warrior, fighting a battle that was bigger than just one man's quest for gold. His death had been the opening shot in a war for justice that Clara was now qualified and obligated to continue. The evidence she'd found changed everything. Morrison and his partners weren't just criminals. They were traitors, using their official positions to steal from the very citizens they'd sworn to protect. Thomas's murder hadn't been motivated by simple greed, but by the need to protect a conspiracy that threatened the entire territorial system. Clara mounted her horse and turned toward the main trail, but not to flee or hide. She was done running from Morrison and his men. Armed with Thomas's rifle and the truth about his murder, she was ready to take the fight to her enemies. But first, she needed to warn Eli. If the conspiracy reached as high as she now suspected, then his journey to Colorado might be leading him into a trap rather than salvation. Federal marshals, who reported to the same authorities who had ordered Thomas's death, couldn't be trusted to provide justice. Clara spurred her horse toward the Colorado Trail, racing through the darkness to intercept her husband before he walked unknowingly into the hands of their enemies. The war for justice was about to begin, but it would be fought on terms that neither Morrison nor his government partners expected. The mountain woman was coming down from the high country, and she was bringing Thomas Vaughn's vengeance with her. Clara caught up with Eli at Willow Creek, 20 miles south of the ranch, just as dawn was breaking over the eastern plains. She found him watering his horse at the creek bank, his military training evident in the way he'd chosen a defensive position with clear sightlines in all directions. "Clara!" He dropped his horse's reins and ran to her, relief and worry warring in his expression. "What are you doing here? You should be safely hidden in the mountains by now. The mountains aren't safe anymore." Morrison's men found the trapper's cabin. They knew exactly where I was headed. Clara dismounted and quickly explained what she'd discovered in Thomas's cache, watching Eli's face grow grim as she revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Morrison was Thomas's partner, Eli repeated, struggling to process the betrayal. He murdered his own ally, Worse than that. Look at this. Clara showed him the letter from Governor Matthews. This goes all the way to the territorial capital, maybe to Washington itself. Eli studied the letter by the growing light, his soldier's mind immediately grasping the tactical implications. If the territorial government is compromised, then federal marshals reporting through normal channels can't be trusted either. That's why I came after you. Your friend in Colorado, does he report directly to Washington, or does he go through territorial authorities? Both, depending on the situation. Eli's expression was troubled. Clara, if this conspiracy reaches as high as you think it does, then we can't trust anyone in official authority. Then we handle it ourselves. 2 people against the entire territorial government? That's not a fight, Clara. That's suicide. Clara pulled Thomas's rifle from her saddle and checked its action, the familiar weight steadying her nerves. Maybe, but Thomas didn't die quietly, and neither will I. Besides, we have advantages they don't expect, such as they think I'm running scared, hiding in the mountains, until you come back with help. They don't know I found Thomas's evidence, and they don't know I understand the true scope of their operation. Clara's smile was fierce. Most importantly, they're used to fighting frightened prospectors and isolated settlers. They've never faced someone who grew up hunting in country where a mistake means death. They spent the morning planning, using Eli's military experience to develop a strategy that might give them a chance against overwhelming odds. The key was to turn Morrison's strengths against him, his confidence, his local authority, and his assumption that 2 people couldn't threaten his carefully constructed empire. We need to split their forces, Eli said, sketching out positions in the dirt. Make them fight on multiple fronts so they can't bring their full strength to bear. And we need to control the battlefield. Choose ground where my mountain skills and your military training give us the advantage. What about the evidence? If we don't survive, Morrison wins permanently. Clara had been thinking about that problem all morning. I'll hide copies in 3 different locations, with instructions for finding them sent to newspapers in Denver and St. Louis. If we don't retrieve the letters within 60 days, they'll be published along with the evidence. Think that will work? It has to. Even if Morrison kills us, the truth will eventually come out. That should make him cautious about eliminating us immediately. They rode back toward the ranch together, but took a circuitous route that allowed Clara to hide the evidence in scattered locations throughout their territory. Each cache was marked with subtle signs that only she could read, ensuring that even if Morrison captured her, he couldn't force her to reveal all the hiding places. By afternoon, they were positioned on a ridge overlooking their ranch buildings, studying the scene through field glasses Eli had acquired during the war. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. Morrison hadn't just occupied their ranch, he'd turned it into a fortress. At least a dozen armed men were visible around the buildings, with more probably concealed inside. The sheriff had brought enough firepower to handle a small war, which suggested he understood exactly how dangerous Clara and Eli had become. They're not just planning to arrest us, Eli observed. They're planning to eliminate us permanently. Look at the barn, Clara said, focusing the glasses on the largest building. They've turned it into a barracks. This isn't a temporary occupation. They're settling in for a siege, which means they know you're not hiding in the mountains. Somehow they figured out we're working together. Clara lowered the glasses, her mind working through the possibilities. Or they captured someone who told them. Doc Henley, maybe, or one of the ranch hands from neighboring properties. Either way, they're ready for us. The question is, are we ready for them? Clara checked Thomas's rifle one more time, then looked at her husband with the steady gaze that had sustained her through 3 years of mountain solitude. I've been ready since the day Thomas disappeared. The only question is whether we're going to let Morrison choose the time and place of our final confrontation. What do you have in mind? Something Morrison won't expect. Instead of attacking his fortress, we bring him to us, on ground of our choosing, at a time that favors our skills over his numbers. They spent the rest of the day preparing their chosen battlefield, a narrow canyon about 5 miles from the ranch where the terrain would force Morrison's men to approach in small groups, rather than as a unified force. Clara used her mountain skills to set traps and establish firing positions, while Eli applied his military training to create overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions. "It's not enough," Eli said as they finished their preparations. "Even if we channel them into the canyon, they still outnumber us 6-1. Numbers aren't everything in country like this. Besides, we have something they don't. What's that? Nothing left to lose." Clara's voice was calm, but her eyes held the cold fire of someone who had chosen to die fighting rather than live in defeat. "Morrison killed my brother, stole our land, and corrupted the entire territorial government. Even if we die tomorrow, we'll die knowing we fought for justice. We're not going to die," Eli said firmly. "We're going to win, expose Morrison's conspiracy, and build the life we promised each other. I hope you're right. But if you're wrong..." Clara moved closer to him, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "I want you to know that these past weeks, fighting beside you, trusting you, it's been the closest I've ever come to happiness." Eli pulled her into his arms, holding her against the cold mountain night. "When this is over, we'll have more than just moments of happiness. We'll have a lifetime." They sent their message to Morrison at dawn, delivered by a ranch hand they paid to ride up to the occupied buildings under a white flag. The message was simple. Clara and Eli Rourke challenged Sheriff Morrison and his men to settle this matter legally. "Meet us at Devil's Canyon at noon for a formal inquiry into the murder of Thomas Vaughn and the conspiracy to steal territorial mining claims. Come prepared to answer for your crimes." It was a calculated insult, designed to provoke Morrison into exactly the kind of rash action that would give them their best chance of survival. By challenging his authority publicly and forcing him to respond on their terms, they were gambling that his arrogance would overcome his caution. The gamble worked. By mid-morning, they could see Morrison's men moving toward the canyon in force, armed for war rather than law enforcement. Morrison himself rode at the head of the column, his face visible even at a distance, twisted with the fury of a man whose authority had been publicly questioned. Clara and Eli took their positions in the rocks above the canyon, Thomas's rifle ready in Clara's hands and Eli's military weapons prepared for the fight of their lives. Below them, the narrow passage waited to channel their enemies into the killing ground they had prepared. "Last chance to run," Eli whispered as Morrison's men entered the canyon. "I'm exactly where I belong," Clara replied, "fighting for my family's honor and our future together." The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls as Morrison led his men into the trap. The final battle for justice in the Wyoming Territory was about to begin. As Morrison's riders entered the canyon, Clara pressed her mother's silver locket into Eli's hand, the only thing she possessed that connected her to the family she'd lost. The locket was tarnished with age and worn smooth by years of handling, but it held the tiny daguerreotype portraits of her parents, taken shortly before the fever claimed them. "Hold this for me," she whispered. "If something happens..." "Nothing's going to happen," Eli said firmly, but he closed his fingers around the locket, understanding the trust she was placing in him. "We fight together. We win together. We go home together." Clara nodded, then turned her attention to the canyon below. Morrison had brought 14 men, more than they'd expected, but not more than their trap could handle. The sheriff rode at the front, his badge glinting in the noon sun, followed by Jacob Steiner and a collection of hard-faced killers who looked like they'd been recruited from the worst saloons on the frontier. "Rourke!" Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Come out and face justice like a man." "Justice," Clara murmured, sighting down Thomas's rifle. "He wouldn't recognize justice if it shot him in the face." Eli had positioned himself 30 yards away, where his military carbine could cover the rear of Morrison's column if they tried to retreat. The plan was simple: let them get deep into the canyon, then hit them from 2 directions simultaneously. The narrow walls would prevent them from spreading out or using their numerical advantage effectively. "A little farther," Clara breathed, watching Morrison's men advance into the killing ground. Just a little farther, but something was wrong. Morrison had stopped his column earlier than expected, and his men were dismounting with the practiced efficiency of experienced fighters, where several of them were moving toward the canyon walls, apparently intending to scale the rocks and attack Clara and Eli's positions from above. They know, Eli realized with growing alarm. Somehow, they know exactly where we are. Morrison's voice boomed across the canyon again. Mrs. Rourke, I know you're up there with that pretty rifle of yours. Same rifle your brother carried when he tried to ambush me 3 years ago. Clara's blood went cold. Morrison was describing Thomas's final moments, taunting her with details that only his killer would know. Thomas never was much of a shot under pressure, Morrison continued. Let's see if mountain living taught you any. Better. The first shots came from 3 directions simultaneously as Morrison's men opened. Fire on the rocky positions where Clara and Eli had concealed themselves. Bullets sparked off stone and whined through the air, forcing them to take cover behind inadequate shelter. Clara returned fire, her first shot taking down one of the men trying to scale the canyon wall. Thomas's rifle spoke with the authority of a weapon that had fed a family through hard times and defended a homestead against raiders. But she was badly outnumbered, and Morrison's men were better organized than she'd expected. They're flanking us, Eli called out, his carbine barking as he engaged targets on the opposite wall. We need to move. But moving meant abandoning their prepared positions and fighting Morrison's men on even terms, a battle they couldn't win. Clara looked down at the silver locket Eli had pressed back into her hand during the confusion, then made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. Cover me, she called to Eli, then stood up in full view of Morrison's men. I'm Clara Vaughn, she shouted, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. You want to settle accounts for Thomas? Then face me yourself, Morrison. Or are you too much of a coward to fight without a dozen men backing you up? The shooting stopped as her challenge echoed off the canyon walls. Morrison sat his horse in the middle of the passage, his face visible now, twisted with fury and something that might have been respect. You've got sand, lady, I'll give you that. Same as your brother had, right up until the moment I put a bullet in his back. Thomas was worth 10 of you, Clara replied, keeping Thomas's rifle trained on Morrison's chest. He died fighting for what was right. You're going to die for 30 pieces of silver and a politician's promise. Morrison laughed, a sound like grinding stone. Your brother died because he was too stupid to understand how the world really works. There's no right and wrong out here, lady, just strong and weak. Your brother was weak, then let's see how strong you are. Just you and me, Morrison. Single combat. Winner takes all. Clara, no! Eli's voice carried desperate urgency. It's a trap! But Clara had already begun climbing down from her position, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years navigating treacherous mountain terrain. She kept Thomas's rifle ready, but her descent was a clear signal that she was willing to meet Morrison on equal terms. Morrison dismounted as well, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. You sure about this, lady? I've killed more men than you've probably seen, I'm sure. Clara reached the canyon floor and walked forward until she was 30 paces from Morrison, close enough for accurate shooting, far enough to give both of them a chance. Thomas deserves justice, and I'm going to give it to him. Justice, Morrison spat in the dust. Your brother got exactly what he deserved. He was a greedy fool who stumbled onto something bigger than he could handle. He was an honest man who discovered you were a murderer and a thief. He was a dead man from the moment he found that gold. Just like you are. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of 3 years' worth of grief and fury. Clara could feel the eyes of Morrison's men watching from the canyon walls, could sense Eli's desperate tension from his position above. But for this moment, this reckoning, there was only herself and the man who had killed her brother. Draw when you're ready, Morrison said, his hand hovering over his weapon. Clara shifted Thomas's rifle slightly, feeling the familiar weight and balance of the weapon that had been her brother's companion through countless mountain hunts. The silver locket pressed against her chest, warm with the heat of her body, connecting her to family and memory and the fierce determination. that had brought her to this moment. "This is for Thomas," she said quietly. Morrison's hand dropped toward his gun with the speed of a professional killer, but Clara was already moving. Thomas's rifle came up smooth and fast, the motion as natural as breathing after years of mountain hunting. She fired just as Morrison cleared leather, the rifle's report echoing like thunder in the confined space of the canyon. Morrison staggered, his revolver flying from nerveless fingers as Clara's bullet took him high in the shoulder. But he was still standing, still dangerous, and his men were already raising their weapons to avenge their fallen leader. "Now, Eli!" Clara shouted, working the lever of Thomas's rifle as Morrison's men opened fire. The canyon erupted in gunsmoke and chaos as the carefully planned ambush became a desperate running battle for survival. The sound of approaching horses thundered through the canyon just as Clara dove for cover behind a fallen boulder, Morrison's wounded form somewhere in the gunsmoke and chaos ahead of her. But these weren't Morrison's reinforcements. The riders wore the blue uniforms of territorial marshals, and their leader carried the distinctive badge that marked him as federal authority. Marshal James Harrison had arrived with 6 deputies. Their timing so perfect that Clara wondered if divine providence had finally decided to favor justice over corruption. Harrison's voice boomed across the canyon with the authority of federal law. "This is United States Marshal Harrison. Lay down your weapons and surrender in the name of the federal government." Morrison's men, caught between Clara and Eli's defensive positions and the federal officers blocking their retreat, found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. Several threw down their weapons immediately, but Jacob Steiner and 3 others decided to fight their way out rather than face federal justice. "Keep Morrison alive." Clara shouted to Eli as she engaged Steiner's group. "We need him to testify." But Morrison, despite his shoulder wound, was crawling toward a rifle dropped by one of his fallen men. Clara saw the movement from the corner of her eye and turned to stop him, just as Steiner's bullet sparked off the rock beside her head. "Clara!" Eli's warning came too late. Steiner had flanked around the boulder and was raising his revolver for a killing shot at point-blank range. Thomas's rifle swung toward Steiner, but Clara knew she wouldn't be fast enough. Time seemed to slow as she saw death approaching in the form of Steiner's steady gun hand and cold eyes. The shot that saved her life came from Marshal Harrison's position, his rifle speaking with federal authority as Steiner spun and fell. But the marshal's intervention came at a cost. Morrison had reached the fallen rifle and was bringing it to bear on Clara's exposed position. "You killed my operation," Morrison snarled, blood streaming down his shirt from his shoulder wound. "But I'll be damned if you live to see me hang." Clara threw herself sideways as Morrison fired, the bullet passing close enough to burn her jacket. She hit the ground hard, Thomas's rifle flying from her hands, and found herself staring up at Morrison's triumphant face as he worked the bolt for a second shot. "Say hello to your brother," Morrison said, raising the rifle to his shoulder. But Morrison had forgotten about Eli, who had been moving through the rocks above with the silent efficiency of a veteran soldier. Eli's shot took Morrison in the center of his chest, the corrupt sheriff falling backward with a look of surprise that death had finally caught up with him. The canyon fell silent except for the ringing echoes of gunfire and the groans of wounded men. Marshal Harrison approached cautiously, his deputies covering the surviving members of Morrison's gang. "Mrs. Rourke." "Mr. Rourke, are you both all right?" Clara picked herself up from the rocky ground, retrieved Thomas's rifle, and walked over to where Morrison lay dying in the dust. The sheriff's eyes were still open, still filled with the malevolent intelligence that had made him so dangerous. "The evidence," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "You'll never find all of it? Goes higher than you think. I already found Thomas's cash," Clara told him. "All of it. Your letters, your partners, your orders from the territorial government. Everyone involved is going to hang." Morrison's laugh was a wet, bubbling sound. "Federal marshals can't touch territorial officials. They'll claim they were deceived. Nothing will change. Maybe. But at least you won't be around to see it." Morrison's eyes fixed on Clara's face with dying hatred. "Your brother screamed when I shot him, begged for his life. Like a coward." Clara knelt beside the dying man, her voice steady and cold. "Thomas died fighting for justice. You're dying for greed and murder. History will remember the difference." Morrison tried to speak again, but death claimed him before the words could form. Clara stood and walked away, feeling no satisfaction in his end, only a deep weariness that came from carrying grief and anger for too long. Marshal Harrison approached her carefully, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Mrs. Rourke, I'm James Harrison, United States Marshal for the Colorado District. I understand you have evidence of federal crimes involving territorial officials. How did you know to come here?" Clara asked. "Your husband reached my friend Captain Mitchell yesterday. When Mitchell explained the situation, I realized this was connected to a federal investigation I've been conducting into territorial corruption. We rode through the night to get here." Clara looked around the canyon, counting the dead and wounded among Morrison's men. "It's over?" "The shooting's over, but if your evidence is as extensive as Captain Mitchell suggested, we'll need your testimony to bring the rest of the conspiracy to justice." Eli climbed down from his position and joined them, his face grim but relieved. "How many of them got away?" "None," Harrison replied. "We had the canyon surrounded. Morrison's entire operation has been eliminated." Clara felt the weight of Thomas's rifle in her hands, the weapon that had carried her through the final confrontation with her brother's killer. The silver locket pressed against her chest, warm with the heat of survival and the promise of justice finally served. "There's something else you should know," she told Marshal Harrison. "Morrison wasn't the only one involved. We have evidence of corruption reaching to the territorial governor himself." Harrison's face was grave. "That's what we suspected. Governor Matthews has been under federal investigation for months, but we needed proof of specific crimes. Your brother's evidence might be exactly what we need to clean up this entire territory." "Thomas would be proud," Eli said, putting his arm around Clara's shoulders. "He died fighting for justice, and justice has finally been served." Clara leaned against her husband, feeling the exhaustion and relief that came after a long battle finally won. Around them, Marshal Harrison's deputies were processing prisoners and securing evidence. But for Clara, the important work was done. Thomas Vaughn could finally rest in peace, and his killers would face the justice they had denied him for 3 years. The conspiracy that had corrupted an entire territory was broken, and the truth would finally see daylight. "It's time to go home," Clara said, looking at the ranch buildings visible in the distance. "Together," Eli agreed. "The way it should have been from the beginning." They walked out of Devil's Canyon side by side, leaving behind the violence and corruption that had shaped their early marriage. Ahead lay the quiet ranch, the coming winter, and the chance to build the partnership they had promised each other in simpler times. The mountain woman had come down from the high country, carrying justice in her hands and Thomas Vaughn's vengeance in her heart. Now she was ready to lay down her rifle and take up the gentler work of building a life with the man who had stood beside her through the darkest chapter of her story. 3 months later, Clara stood in the same whitewashed church where she and Eli had first exchanged vows, but this time the ceremony felt entirely different. Doc Henley had suggested they renew their marriage vows, now that the practical arrangement had become something deeper, and the whole community had turned out to witness their true union. Clara wore a new dress, cream-colored silk that complemented her eyes, and Eli had commissioned a simple gold wedding ring from the local blacksmith, crafted from Thomas's gold dust, a circle of metal that connected their future to her brother's memory. The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the church windows as Reverend Powell spoke the familiar words. "Do you, Eli Rourke, take Clara to be your wife, to love and cherish in times of joy and sorrow, prosperity and adversity, until death do you part?" "I do." Eli's voice was strong and certain, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "And do you, Clara Rourke, take Eli to be your husband, to love and cherish in times of joy and sorrow, Prosperity and adversity until death do you part? I do. Clara's voice carried the conviction of a woman who had found her place in the world after years of searching. When they kissed this time, it was with the passion of two people who had chosen each other not from necessity, but from love, hard-won through shared trials and mutual respect. The congregation erupted in applause, but Clara was only aware of Eli's arms around her and the promise of their future together. The aftermath of Morrison's defeat had brought changes to the entire territory. Governor Matthews had been arrested by federal marshals and transported to Denver to face charges of conspiracy and murder. 3 territorial judges had been removed from office, and a federal administrator had been appointed to oversee new elections. The corruption that had infected Wyoming Territory for years was finally being rooted out. Clara's testimony had been crucial to the federal investigation. Her careful documentation of Thomas's evidence, combined with the records they'd recovered from Morrison's operation, had provided prosecutors with everything they needed to secure convictions. 12 men had been sentenced to hang for their roles in the conspiracy, and dozens more faced prison terms. The gold mine that had cost Thomas his life was now legally Clara's, as his only surviving heir. The initial surveys suggested it was even richer than Thomas had believed, potentially worth enough to make the Rourkes wealthy beyond anything either of them had imagined. But wealth seemed less important now than the simple pleasure of working their ranch together and building something lasting. Doc Henley approached them after the ceremony. His weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "I have to say, you two make a much more convincing couple this time around. Practice makes perfect," Eli said, his arm around Clara's waist. "Speaking of which," Clara said, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat stomach, "we'll be needing your services again in about 6 months. Doc, Henley's eyebrows rose in delight. "Well, I'll be blessed. The territory's getting a new generation of Rourkes." Clara felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with joy as she spoke the words aloud for the first time. She'd suspected for weeks, but had wanted to be certain before telling even Eli. The baby would be born in early spring, when the mountain snows melted and the plains turned green with new grass. "A son," Eli said wonderfully, his face bright with amazement. "Could be a daughter," Clara warned. But she was smiling. Either way, they'll be strong. Mountain-born and frontier-raised, with parents who know how to fight for what's right. The reception that followed was the kind of community celebration that bonded neighbors into family. Everyone who had been touched by Morrison's corruption, which was most of the county, seemed determined to make this day a celebration of justice and renewal. Jacob, Steiner's ranch, had been sold to pay restitution to the families of men Morrison had killed. The new owners were a young couple from Colorado, honest farmers who planned to raise cattle and children in equal measure. The territory was attracting good people again, now that corrupt officials no longer posed a threat to honest settlers. As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, Clara and Eli rode home together through country that finally felt peaceful. Their ranch buildings stood silhouetted against the evening sky, no longer a fortress under siege, but a home where love had taken root and grown strong. Clara had hung Thomas's rifle over the fireplace mantel, where it would remain as a reminder of the price of justice and the importance of standing up for what was right. Beside it sat his compass, its needle now pointing true north since the metallic interference from his hidden cache had been removed. The compass would guide their children someday, teaching them to find their way through whatever wilderness life might present. "Eli," Clara said, as they unsaddled their horses in the barn that had once housed Morrison's men, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't ridden down from the mountains that day?" "Every day," he admitted. "I think about the man I was before you came, bitter, isolated, slowly dying inside without even knowing it. You didn't just bring me a wife. Clara, you brought me back to life. Thomas always said the mountains teach you that survival isn't about avoiding danger. It's about facing it with people you trust beside you." Clara hung up her saddle and brushed. down her horse with the easy efficiency of someone who had found peace in routine tasks. I couldn't have survived Morrison's conspiracy alone, but together we were stronger than anything he could throw at us. They walked to the cabin hand in hand, their wedding clothes slightly dusty from the ride, but their hearts light with the knowledge that their struggles were finally behind them. Inside, the rooms that had once been a practical arrangement between strangers now felt like the foundation of something permanent and beautiful. "There's something I want to show you," Clara said, leading Eli to the bedroom where she'd prepared a surprise during the weeks following Morrison's defeat. She opened Thomas's old travel chest and withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle. Inside was a quilt she'd been working on in the evenings, using fabric from her mountain clothes and pieces of Eli's old army uniform. The pattern told the story of their journey together, mountain peaks and prairie grasses, rifles and wedding rings, all stitched together with the patient skill her mother had taught her years ago for the baby's room, she explained. "So they'll know where they came from and what their parents fought to build." Eli traced the intricate patterns with gentle fingers, seeing their entire story told in cloth and thread. "It's beautiful, Clara, just like everything else you've brought to this place." "To our place," she corrected. "Thomas's gold will make us wealthy, but this ranch, this life we're building, that's what makes us rich." They stood together in the lamplight, the quilt spread between them like a map of their future. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees with the voice of freedom and promise. The mountains that had sheltered Clara in her years of solitude now stood as guardians over their valley, and the plains that had isolated Eli in his grief now stretched endlessly toward horizons bright with possibility. "Do you think Thomas would approve?" Clara asked, her hand moving to her stomach where new life was growing. "I think Thomas would be proud that his sister chose love over revenge, and that his sacrifice led to something beautiful instead of just more violence." Eli pulled Clara close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "He'd want you to be happy, Clara. He'd want us both to live the life he never got to have." Clara nodded, tears of gratitude rather than grief brightening her eyes. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll live for all of us, Thomas, our parents, everyone who didn't get the chance to see how this story ends." As they prepared for bed in the cabin that had become their true home, Clara felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The mountain woman, who had ridden down with a desperate proposition, had found something she'd never expected to discover: a partner who would stand with her through anything. A love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than steel. The baby kicked gently as she settled into sleep, already restless with the frontier spirit that would carry the Rourke name into the next century. Clara smiled in the darkness, her hand intertwined with Eli's, and dreamed of spring mornings, when their child would learn to ride these same plains and explore these same mountains that had shaped their parents' love story. Sometimes the loneliest people find each other when they need it most, and sometimes a practical arrangement becomes the foundation for something eternal. In the high plains of Wyoming Territory, where the wind carries promises across endless grassland and the mountains keep their ancient watch over the valley, Clara and Eli Rourke had built more than just a marriage. They had built a legacy that would endure long after the last. Echoes of gunfire had faded from Devil's Canyon. The mountain woman had found her place in the world, and the lonely cowboy had discovered that some partnerships are worth fighting for. Together, they would raise strong children who understood the value of justice, the importance of courage, and the transformative power of love that chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. Their story had begun with 6 words that changed everything. "I need a husband, and you need strong sons." It would continue for generations, written in the lives of children who would never know a world where their parents hadn't fought to make it better.